Court verdict declares, human male must marry the alien granddaughters of the consul. Daniel Chen had been flying cargo ships for 8 years, and he thought he knew every route like the back of his hand. But that Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. He was hauling construction materials through the neutral zone between Earth and the Vrixian territories when his navigation system glitched. One moment he was on course, the next moment alarms were screaming and his ship was spinning out of control. The collision happened so fast. Metal screeched against metal, sparks flew everywhere, and Daniel's ship slammed into another vessel. When everything finally stopped moving, he sat there shaking, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The other ship was a luxury transport, the kind that important people use. Daniel's stomach dropped when he realized what he'd done. Within minutes, patrol ships surrounded both vessels. Officers boarded his ship and told him he was under arrest. Daniel couldn't believe it. Yes, he'd made a terrible mistake, but it was an accident. His navigation computer had failed. Surely they would understand that, right? But as they put restraints on his wrists and led him away, he saw the other ship's passengers being helped out. 2 young women, clearly aliens, were being examined by medics. They looked shaken up but not seriously hurt. Daniel spent 3 days in a holding cell before anyone told him what was really going on. When his lawyer finally arrived, the news was worse than he'd imagined. The 2 women he'd crashed into were the granddaughters of Consul Yarinth, one of the most important diplomatic figures in the Vixian Empire. Their grandfather wasn't just anyone. He represented his entire species in negotiations with Earth. His lawyer, an older woman named Rodriguez, sat down across from him with a thick folder of documents. She didn't look happy. Daniel asked her what kind of trouble he was in, and she took a deep breath before answering. The granddaughters had something called resonance trauma. It was a Vrixian condition that humans didn't fully understand. When they experienced severe stress or fear, their nervous systems could lock up in a way that normal medicine couldn't fix. Daniel felt awful. He hadn't meant to hurt anyone. Bess. He asked what he could do to help, maybe pay for special treatment or something. That's when Rodriguez told him about the trial. There was going to be an interstellar tribunal, which meant judges from both Earth and the Vrixian Empire would decide his fate. Daniel asked about his options, and Rodriguez laid out 2 possibilities. Pay. Neither one was good. Option 1 was 20 years in a Vrixian detention facility. Daniel had heard stories about those places. They weren't cruel, but they were designed for Vrixian prisoners who could handle different gravity, different air, different everything. A human serving time there would suffer. 20 years might as well be a life sentence. He'd be over 50 when he got out, if he survived at all. Option 2 sounded crazy when Rodriguez first explained it. Under something called the Treaty of Proxima, which governed how humans and aliens dealt with legal matters, the Vrixians could invoke traditional restitution laws. Consul Yarinth had chosen to do exactly that. According to ancient Vrixian custom, when someone caused resonance trauma, they had to help heal it through a bonding ritual. The consul was demanding that Daniel marry both of his granddaughters in a ceremonial union that would last 1 full Earth year. Daniel laughed at first. He thought Rodriguez was joking, but she wasn't smiling. She explained that he would have to live with them, participate in their daily routines, learn their customs, and genuinely try to help them recover from the trauma he'd caused. It wasn't a real marriage in the human sense, but it was legally binding under interstellar law. If he refused or failed to fulfill his obligations, he'd go straight to that detention facility for 20 years. The trial happened faster than Daniel expected. He stood in an enormous courtroom with judges from 3 different species looking down at him. The consul himself was there, a tall figure with deep purple skin and eyes that seemed to look right through Daniel. His granddaughters sat beside him, and Daniel got his first good look at them. Wait, they were younger than he'd expected. Probably in their 20s by human standards. One had silver markings on her face and sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, but the other kept glancing at Daniel with an expression he couldn't quite read. The prosecutor presented evidence of the crash. Rocks. They showed sensor logs, damage reports, medical scans of the granddaughters. Daniel's lawyer argued that the navigation failure wasn't his fault, that he'd filed complaints about that system before. But the judges didn't seem to care much about whose fault it was. Under Vrixian law, causing harm meant owing restitution, regardless of intent. When it was time for Consul Yarinth to speak, the whole courtroom went quiet. He talked about his granddaughters, how they'd lost their parents years ago in an accident involving a human transport ship, how he'd raised them himself, protected them, kept them safe. And now another human had hurt them. His voice was calm, but everyone could hear the pain underneath it. He said he didn't want revenge. He wanted healing. He wanted Daniel to understand what he'd done and make it right. The lead judge, a stern Vrixian woman with gray markings, asked Daniel if he understood the consul's request. Daniel stood up, his legs shaking. He said yes, he understood. She asked if he chose 20 years detention or 1 year of ceremonial union with the consul's granddaughters. Daniel looked at the two young women. Breath. They looked back at him. Neither of them seemed happy about any of this. He thought about 20 years in an alien prison. He thought about his life, his freedom, his future. Pace. Then he thought about the fear in those women's eyes when they'd been pulled from the crashed ship. He'd done that to them. Maybe he did owe them something. Daniel took a deep breath and said he would accept the union. He would try to help them heal. The judge banged her gavel and declared the verdict. Daniel Chen would enter into a 1-year ceremonial bonding with Lyra and Senna Yarinth, granddaughters of the consul. He would live under the consul's roof, follow Vrixian customs, and participate in all required healing rituals. Breath. At the end of 1 year, if the union was deemed successful, he would be free to go. If he failed, prison was waiting. As guards led Daniel out of the courtroom, he caught one more glimpse of his new family. The consul looked satisfied. The granddaughter with silver markings looked disgusted. The other one just looked sad. Daniel wondered what he'd gotten himself into. His whole life had just been decided by alien laws he barely understood. Starting tomorrow, he would be living with strangers who probably hated him, trying to fix damage he hadn't meant to cause. 1 year suddenly seemed like a very, very long time. Daniel's first morning at the consul's estate started badly. A servant woke him before dawn, leading him through hallways that seemed to go on forever. The estate was huge, much bigger than it looked from outside. Every wall had strange artwork showing scenes from Vrixian history. The air smelled like something sweet and unfamiliar, and the gravity felt just slightly wrong, making Daniel stumble every few steps. They brought him to a dining hall where Consul Yarinth sat at the head of a long table. The two granddaughters sat on either side. Daniel was directed to sit at the far end, facing the consul. Breakfast was already laid out, but nothing looked like human food. There were purple fruits that seemed to pulse with their own light, some kind of grain that moved slightly in the bowl, and a drink that changed colors when Daniel looked at it. The consul spoke without looking up from his meal. Pass. He explained the rules. Daniel would wake at dawn every day. He would share 3 meals with the family. He would participate in meditation sessions each afternoon. He would spend evenings learning Vrixian language and customs. He would attend all family gatherings and ceremonies. Most importantly, he would make genuine effort to bond with Lyra and Senna. The Consul had ways of knowing if Daniel was just going through the motions. Lyra, the one with silver markings, finally spoke. Her voice was cold and sharp. She said she wanted to make one thing clear. This arrangement was not her choice. She was only participating because the alternative was worse for everyone. Daniel should not expect friendship. He should not expect kindness. He should do what was required and nothing more. When the year was over, they would never see each other again. Her sister Senna looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Daniel tried to eat the strange food and nearly gagged. The purple fruit tasted like metal and sadness somehow. The grain was chewy and stuck to his teeth. The drink burned his throat. The Consul watched him struggle and said that learning to appreciate Vrixian food was part of the bonding process. Daniel would eat what they ate. No special human meals would be prepared. The meditation sessions were even worse than the food. They gathered in a circular room with no furniture, just soft mats on the floor. An instructor, an elderly Vrixian with white markings, guided them through breathing exercises that made Daniel dizzy. Lyra sat across from him, eyes closed, perfectly calm. Every time Daniel shifted or made a noise, she would open one eye and glare at him. The instructor kept saying he needed to clear his mind and open his spirit, but Daniel's mind was full of questions and his spirit felt pretty firmly closed. Senna was gentler during these sessions. Once, when Daniel was struggling to hold a particular pose, she quietly showed him an easier variation. Lyra immediately snapped at her in their own language. Senna looked away and didn't help again after that. Daniel felt guilty for getting her in trouble. Evenings brought language lessons that made Daniel's head hurt. Vrixian had sounds humans weren't designed to make. His teacher, a patient but frustrated linguist, kept telling him to use the back of his throat more, to click his tongue in specific ways. After 2 hours, Daniel could barely say hello correctly. Lyra attended these sessions too, supposedly to help, but mostly she just corrected his mistakes with obvious contempt. 2 weeks passed this way. Daniel woke tired, struggled through strange meals, failed at meditation, embarrassed himself at language lessons, and fell into bed exhausted. He was miserable, and he could tell the granddaughters were just as unhappy. Lyra barely spoke to him, except to criticize. Senna was polite but distant, like someone doing a job they hated but couldn't quit. Then one afternoon, things shifted slightly. They were in the meditation room, and Daniel was supposed to be visualizing his spirit or something, but he was actually thinking about pizza. His stomach growled loudly in the quiet room. Senna made a small sound, almost like a laugh she tried to hold back. Daniel opened his eyes and saw her covering her mouth. Bare. Eyes met and she smiled. Just for a second. It was the first smile he'd seen from anyone in 2 weeks. After the session, Senna approached him in the hallway. She said that she understood human food was hard to adjust to. Her parents had worked with humans before they died, and she remembered them talking about how much humans missed their own cuisine. She couldn't get him pizza, but there was a kitchen where she sometimes made her own snacks. Maybe she could show him which Vrixian foods were closest to human tastes. Daniel followed her to a smaller kitchen he hadn't known existed. Senna moved around the space with easy confidence, pulling out various ingredients. She explained that this sweet root was similar to human potatoes. This grain was less aggressive than what they served at breakfast. This fruit was actually sweet instead of weird. She made him a simple dish that looked almost normal. When Daniel tasted it, he nearly cried. It wasn't human food, but it was actually good. While he ate, Senna talked. She said that Lyra wasn't always so cold. Before the accident, her sister had been different. Lyra was brilliant, a scientist who studied how different species' biology worked. She'd been piloting their transport that day because she wanted to test a theory about gravitational fields. When the crash happened, Lyra had been at the controls. She blamed herself as much as she blamed Daniel. Daniel felt something shift inside him. He'd been so focused on his own situation that he hadn't really thought about theirs. They hadn't chosen this either. They were as trapped as he was. He asked Senna about the resonance trauma. Psh, she tried to explain it, though she said humans didn't have anything quite like it. When Vrixians experienced intense fear or shock, their neural pathways could sort of freeze. It caused nightmares, anxiety, physical pain. The only way to reset those pathways was through bonding with the source of the trauma, breath. She admitted she was still having nightmares about the crash. She would wake up feeling like she was spinning, unable to breathe, certain she was going to die. Because her grandfather had tried everything, every Vrixian treatment available. Nothing worked. Base. That's why he'd invoked the old law. He was desperate. Bay. Daniel asked if spending time with him, the person who'd caused the crash, wasn't making things worse. Senna thought about it and said something surprising. Bah, she said, that actually seeing him struggle with their food and language and customs made him seem less like a monster and more like a person. It was helping, slowly. That evening, Daniel tried harder at his language lesson. When Lyra corrected him, he didn't get defensive. Bah. He thanked her and asked her to show him the right way again. She looked surprised, but did it. He practiced the sounds until his throat hurt. Lyra said his pronunciation was still terrible, but slightly less terrible than before. Coming from her, it felt like high praise. The next day at breakfast, Daniel ate the disgusting purple fruit without complaining. The consul noticed and nodded slightly. Lyra noticed too, though she pretended not to. During meditation, Daniel actually managed to clear his mind for almost a full minute before his thoughts wandered. The instructor praised his progress. Prime. Senna smiled at him again. Things were still hard, and Daniel still missed his old life desperately. But for the first time since the verdict, he felt like maybe, just maybe, this year wouldn't be completely unbearable. He was starting to see his new family as real people with their own pain and struggles. And maybe, slowly, they were starting to see him the same way. By the end of the second month, Daniel's life had settled into a strange routine. He could eat most Vrixian food without gagging now. His meditation breathing came naturally. He could hold basic conversations in their language, though anything complicated still left him confused. The consul had stopped watching him with quite so much suspicion. Senna had become almost friendly, sometimes seeking him out to show him plants in the estate gardens or to practice art together. Hera was the holdout. She remained distant, speaking to Daniel only when necessary and always with that edge of contempt in her voice. He'd learned to read her moods a little. When her markings darkened to almost black, she was stressed. When she snapped at everyone, including the servants, she'd had a bad day in her laboratory. When she disappeared into her private quarters for hours, she was hiding from something. One evening, Daniel found Lyra in the estate's library, surrounded by stacks of technical documents. She didn't notice him at first. She was muttering to herself in Vrixian, occasionally marking notes on a datapad. Daniel recognized some of the symbols from his language lessons. They were related to navigation and gravitational fields. He realized she was still studying the crash, trying to understand exactly what had gone wrong. When Lyra finally noticed him watching, she immediately closed all her displays. She asked what he wanted with clear irritation. Daniel took a chance and asked if she was researching the accident. Lyra's markings went nearly black. She said it was none of his business, but Daniel didn't leave. He said he'd been thinking about that day too, replaying it over and over. His navigation system had failed, but he'd made mistakes too. He'd been tired from a long route. He'd ignored a maintenance warning the previous week. He'd taken a shortcut through that section of the neutral zone even though he knew it was tricky. Lyra stared at him for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised him. Burst of suffering. She said his navigation failure wasn't random. The gravitational fields in that region were unstable, something she'd been trying to prove for months. Ships had been having technical problems there for years, but no one listened because the problems were sporadic. She'd convinced her grandfather to take that route specifically so she could gather readings. She'd put them in danger because of her research. Daniel sat down across from her. He said that if she was responsible for being there, and he was responsible for the crash, then maybe they'd both messed up. Maybe that's why they were both so angry. Lyra's markings flickered between dark and silver. She admitted she'd been spending months trying to find a way to blame him completely, to make it all his fault. Because if it was all his fault, she didn't have to feel so guilty. But, looking at the data honestly, they'd both made choices that led to that moment. They talked for hours that night. Lyra showed him her research, explaining in simple terms how gravitational shears could corrupt navigation systems. Daniel told her about the pressures cargo pilots faced, the long hours, the deferred maintenance, the shortcuts everyone took because companies cared more about profit than safety. They weren't friends by the end of the conversation, but something had shifted. They were two people who'd both made mistakes and were both trying to live with the consequences. The next morning at breakfast, Lyra actually asked Daniel how he'd slept. It was the first personal question she'd ever asked him. The consul nearly dropped his utensils in surprise. Senna looked delighted. Daniel said he'd slept fine and asked Lyra the same question back. She admitted she'd had another nightmare about the crash. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. So he just said he was sorry. Lyra nodded and went back to her meal, but the hostility was gone from her voice. The breakthrough with Lyra changed the entire household. Meals became almost pleasant. The three of them started having actual conversations instead of awkward silence. Senna taught Daniel about Vrixian art, and he was surprised to discover he enjoyed it. Lyra occasionally explained scientific concepts to him, and he was surprised to find he could mostly follow along. The consul watched these changes with something that might have been satisfaction. Then the meditation instructor introduced a new practice, vibration. They would do something called resonance sharing, where they opened their minds to each other's emotional states. It was supposed to deepen their bond and help heal the remaining trauma. The instructor warned them it would be intense and uncomfortable. Everyone would feel vulnerable. The first session was overwhelming. Daniel felt Senna's lingering fear from the crash wash over him like cold water. He felt Lyra's complicated guilt and anger tangled up together. And they felt his emotions too, his shame and regret, and desperate wish that he could undo what he'd done. By the end, all three of them were shaking. But something had changed. They'd seen inside each other's hearts. After that session, Senna started talking to Daniel about her nightmares in detail. She described the spinning sensation, the moment when she thought they would all die. Daniel listened and shared his own fears from that day, how he'd been certain he would kill someone with his mistake. Talking about it seemed to help her. The nightmares became less frequent. Lyra opened up too, in her own way. She admitted she'd stopped piloting after the crash. She was too afraid she'd make another mistake. Daniel told her that if she let one accident stop her from doing what she loved, then fear had won. Lyra said that was easy for him to say since he hadn't been the one at the controls. Daniel pointed out that he'd been at the controls of the ship that actually hit them, so he knew exactly what she was feeling. The household settled into something almost comfortable. Daniel still missed his old life, his freedom, his human friends and human food and human everything. But he had to admit this wasn't the nightmare he'd expected. The three of them had formed something real. Not quite friendship, but not enemies either. They were three people learning to live together and helping each other heal from shared trauma. The Consul started giving them more freedom. They could explore the diplomatic quarter together. They attended cultural events. Daniel met other humans who'd bonded with aliens through various circumstances, and he realized his situation wasn't as unique as he'd thought. The universe was full of people from different worlds learning to build bridges. 4 months into the year, Daniel realized something that scared him. He didn't hate being there anymore. Some mornings he actually looked forward to breakfast conversations with Lyra and Senna. He enjoyed their meditation sessions. He loved walking through the gardens with Senna while she pointed out plants from her home world. He appreciated Lyra's sharp mind and the way she challenged him to think differently. But he also remembered this was temporary. 8 months left, and then he would leave. The union would be dissolved. They would go their separate ways. That had always been the plan, the deal, the sentence. So why did the thought of leaving make him feel sad? The trouble started on a normal Tuesday morning. Daniel woke to shouting outside the estate. He looked out his window and saw protesters gathered at the gates. Some held signs in English saying things like "humans for humans" and "no alien marriages." Others held signs in Vrixian that Daniel couldn't fully read, but the angry tone was clear enough. At breakfast, the consul explained what was happening. A journalist had exposed their story, and it had become interstellar news. Some humans saw Daniel as a traitor, forced into a marriage with aliens when he should have just served his time in prison. Some Vrixians saw the Granddaughters as dishonored, bound to a human who wasn't good enough for them. Both sides were angry, and their anger was feeding off each other. Security around the estate increased. Guards checked everyone who entered. The consul forbade Daniel, Lyra, and Senna from leaving the grounds for their own safety. They were trapped inside, and the protesters outside grew louder each day. Daniel could hear them chanting sometimes, angry voices demanding the union be dissolved. Lyra withdrew into her laboratory, barely coming out except for required meals and meditations. Senna tried to maintain normalcy, but Daniel could see the strain. Her nightmares returned with new intensity. Now she dreamed not just about the crash, but about angry mobs breaking through the windows. Daniel felt helpless. He'd caused all this. If not for his mistake months ago, none of them would be in this situation. The death threats started arriving in the second week. Most were anonymous messages sent through various channels. Some threatened the consul for allowing the union. Some threatened Daniel for agreeing to it. Some threatened Lyra and Senna for participating. The consul tried to keep the worst ones from his granddaughters, but they found out anyway. Senna stopped sleeping well. Lyra's markings stayed dark all the time. Then came the message from the Brixian High Council. They were under pressure from traditionalists back on the home world. The Union was becoming a political problem. They were recommending that the Consul dissolve the arrangement early. Daniel could serve his prison time instead, and the Granddaughters could be sent back to the home world where they'd be safe from the controversy. The Consul called a family meeting to discuss it. For the first time, he asked Daniel's opinion. What did he want to do? Daniel looked at Lyra and Senna. Lyra's face was carefully neutral, but her markings were flickering rapidly. Senna looked like she might cry, but was holding it back. Daniel said he would do whatever they wanted. If they felt unsafe, if they wanted him gone, he would go to prison. No argument. Lyra stood up abruptly and left the room. The Consul sighed. Senna said quietly that she didn't want Daniel to go to prison because of them. He'd done nothing wrong except try to help them heal. Sending him away now felt cruel. The Consul looked older than usual. He said he would think about it and make a decision in a few days. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He walked through the estate's halls, something he did sometimes when his mind was too busy. He found himself outside Lyra's laboratory. Light showed under the door. He knocked softly, and after a long pause, Lyra told him to come in. She was sitting at her workstation, but she wasn't working.
She was just staring at a blank screen. Daniel asked if she was okay.
Lyra laughed, a bitter sound. She said nothing was okay. The crash had been bad enough, but now their attempt to heal from it had turned into a political crisis. She'd brought shame on her family. A grandfather was being criticized by the High Council, and it was all because she'd insisted on taking that route to gather research data. Daniel sat down near her. He said she couldn't blame herself for everything. Plenty of people were making this mess worse, but they'd chosen to do that. The protesters, the politicians, the people sending threats. They were responsible for their own actions. Lyra said maybe, but she and Senna wouldn't be targets if not for the Union. Daniel pointed out that the Union wouldn't exist if not for the crash, and the crash wouldn't have happened without multiple failures, not just Lyra's research plans. They sat in silence for a while. Then Lyra said something that surprised Daniel. She said the last 4 months had been strange but not terrible. She'd learned things about humans she hadn't known before. Daniel was stubborn and made awful jokes and still couldn't pronounce half of Vixian words correctly. But he was sincere. He'd genuinely tried to help them heal. She didn't want him to go to prison because of this mess. Embarrassed. Daniel felt something warm in his chest. He realized over these months he'd come to care about both of the sisters. Not in the romantic way the ceremonial union was supposed to represent, but as real friends, maybe even family. He told Lyra he didn't want to leave them either, but he also didn't want them in danger because of him. Lyra turned to look at him directly. Her markings had lightened to silver. She said that her people believed in facing challenges directly, not running from them. If they dissolved the Union now, it would look like the protesters had won. It would send a message that humans and Vrixians couldn't overcome differences. Was that really the message they wanted to send? The next morning, Lyra and Senna spoke to their grandfather together. Daniel wasn't there for the conversation. But afterward, the Consul called him into his office. He said his granddaughters had made their wishes clear. They wanted to continue the Union despite the protests. They believed, and he was starting to agree, that completing the full year would be a stronger statement than giving up early. But He wanted to be sure Daniel understood the risk. The threats were real. Base. Security could only do so much. Daniel thought about prison, about spending 20 years in an alien facility far from Earth. Then he thought about walking away from Lyra and Senna now, when they needed support. He told the consul he wanted to stay. The consul nodded slowly and said that Daniel had grown since arriving at his estate. He wasn't the careless pilot who'd crashed into his family anymore. He was someone the consul was beginning to respect. That afternoon, the consul held a press conference. He stood with his granddaughters on either side and Daniel slightly behind them. He announced that they would continue the ceremonial union for the full year as originally decreed. He said that fear and hatred would not dictate their choices. He challenged both humans and Vrixians to show the same courage. The protesters grew louder that night, but inside the estate, something felt different. The four of them had chosen to face this together. Daniel realized that somewhere along the way he'd stopped thinking about the end of the year as freedom. He'd started thinking about it as goodbye. And that scared him more than any protest, because he was falling in love with both of them in different ways. And he had no idea what to do about it. 3 months remained in the ceremonial union when everything fell apart. Consul Yarns collapsed during breakfast one morning. The estate's medical team rushed him to their treatment center. Within hours, doctors determined he needed specialized care only available on the Vrixian homeworld. He would need to leave immediately and might be gone for weeks or even months. Before the medical transport took him away, the consul called Daniel to his bedside. His markings were faint, his breathing labored. He said that watching the three of them together over these months had given him hope for the future. When he'd first invoked the old law, he'd been angry and desperate. Now he saw it as the best decision he'd ever made. His granddaughters had healed more than he dared imagine. The consul said Daniel had fulfilled his obligation completely. When the consul returned, he would petition the interstellar court for early termination of the union. Daniel could be free within weeks instead of months. Daniel should have felt relief. Early freedom meant escaping the protesters, the threats, the constant pressure. But as he watched the medical team prepare the consul for transport, all he felt was a crushing weight in his chest. He thanked the consul quietly and left the room before his emotions showed too much. That evening, security was reduced with the consul gone. The estate had standing guards, but the additional protective detail had been assigned specifically to protect the consul. The household felt emptier, quieter. Daniel, Lyra, and Senna ate dinner together in uncomfortable silence. Lyra pushed food around her plate without eating. Senna kept glancing at Daniel like she wanted to say something, but didn't know how. Finally, Lyra spoke. She asked Daniel if he was happy about leaving early. Her voice was carefully neutral, but Daniel heard something underneath it. He didn't know how to answer. Hey. After a long pause, he said he would do whatever they wanted. If they wanted him gone, he'd go. If they wanted him to stay the full year, he'd stay. Lyra made a frustrated sound and said she wasn't asking what they wanted. She was asking what he wanted. Daniel looked at both of them. Senna was watching him with those expressive eyes that had always been easier to read than Lyra's. Lyra sat perfectly still, waiting for his answer. Daniel realized he was tired of hiding the truth. He said he didn't want to leave at all. The last 6 months had been the strangest of his life, but also maybe the best. He'd learn more about himself living with them than in all his years flying alone through space. And somewhere along the way, he'd fallen in love with both of them. The words hung in the air. Senna's eyes went wide. Lyra froze completely. Daniel continued before he lost his nerve. He said he knew the union was supposed to be ceremonial only, not real. Brave. He knew they'd probably never feel the same way, but he couldn't lie anymore. The thought of leaving them in a few weeks made him feel like he was losing something precious he'd only just found. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Lyra stood abruptly and walked to the window, her back to them. Bess. Daniel's heart sank. He'd ruined everything by admitting too much. But then Senna reached across the table and took his hand. She said she'd been in love with him for months. Beth. She'd been terrified to say anything because the union was temporary, and admitting feelings would only make the ending hurt worse. Daniel stared at her. Then he looked at Lyra, still standing at the window. He asked if she'd known. Lyra turned around slowly, and Daniel saw something in her face he'd never seen before. Vulnerability. She said of course she'd known. She always knew what her sister was feeling. And she'd been dealing with the same problem herself, falling for someone she was supposed to only tolerate for a year. She'd thought Daniel was counting down the days until his freedom. But she'd been preparing herself for him to leave and never look back. The three of them stared at each other, the truth finally spoken. Then Senna started laughing, almost hysterically. She said they'd all been in love with each other and hiding it for months, making themselves miserable for no reason. Lyra made a sound between a laugh and a sob. Daniel felt like his heart might burst, but their moment was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. Alarms started blaring throughout the estate.
The security system's automated voice announced a breach in the outer defenses. Someone had cut through the fence and was inside the grounds.
Guards appeared and rushed them toward the safe room, a reinforced chamber in the center of the estate designed for exactly this kind of emergency. Through the windows, Daniel saw figures moving in the gardens. The extremists had chosen tonight, with the Consul gone and security reduced, to make their statement. He heard shouting in both English and Vixian. The coalition of human and alien radicals had found common ground in their hatred. The safe room sealed behind them with a heavy thunk. Emergency displays showed cameras throughout the estate. Daniel watched intruders spreading through the building, searching room by room. They were destroying everything, spraying hateful messages on walls, smashing furniture. Some carried weapons. They were looking for the three of them. Lyra was already at the safe room's control panel, pulling up technical schematics. Psst. Senna activated the communication systems, trying to call for help. But someone had jammed the signals. No calls could get through. They were trapped and isolated. Grasp. The security guards were outnumbered and falling back. It was only a matter of time before the intruders found the safe room. Daniel felt strangely calm. He looked at Lyra working furiously at the controls, and Senna trying every frequency to break through the jamming. He realized that if this was the end, at least they were together. At least they'd finally told each other the truth. But he said they needed to work together. His piloting experience, Lyra's scientific knowledge, Senna's understanding of the estate systems, combined they might have a chance. Lyra pulled up the building's infrastructure. Every system was designed with multiple redundancies for diplomatic security. She found the emergency protocol controls and started explaining her plan rapidly. If they could trigger specific systems in sequence, they could trap the intruders while alerting authorities outside the jamming range. But it would require perfect timing and coordination. Daniel saw the pattern she was describing and recognized it from navigation. It was like plotting a course through obstacles, except the obstacles were intruders and the course was through the estate's security grid. Senna added her knowledge of how the systems actually functioned in practice, not just in theory. Together, the three of them built a plan. They worked through the night, using the safe room's controls to manipulate the estate's systems. They sealed corridors behind intruders, cutting off their retreat. They activated emergency barriers that hadn't been used in years. They routed power through auxiliary systems to boost a communication signal through the jamming. And when the intruders finally found the safe room and started trying to break through its defenses, they triggered the final sequence. Breath. Every door in the estate locked simultaneously, trapping the intruders in separate rooms. Emergency alerts went out on every frequency. The estate's own defense systems activated, using non-lethal deterrents to keep the intruders contained until authorities could arrive. Within minutes, security forces were swarming the grounds. When it was finally safe to emerge, Daniel, Lyra, and Senna walked out of the safe room exhausted but unharmed. The estate was a mess, but they'd protected each other. They'd worked together perfectly, trusting each other completely. As dawn broke over the diplomatic quarter, they stood together surveying the damage, still holding hands. The Consul returned 2 weeks later, his health stabilized. The story of how his granddaughters and their human bondmate had defended the estate against extremists had become interstellar news. This time, the narrative was different. People saw three individuals from two worlds standing together against hatred. Support flooded in from both humans and Vrixians who'd been silent before. The Consul called Daniel to a private meeting. He said that technically, the original union had been fulfilled. Daniel was legally free to leave, but there was another option. The Vrixian High Council, moved by recent events, had approved something unprecedented. They would allow a permanent triad union, a genuine marriage between the three of them, if all parties consented. It would be complex legally, challenging socially, and probably controversial forever. But it would be real! Daniel said he needed to ask Lyra and Senna directly. The Consul smiled and said they were waiting in the garden. Daniel found them there, standing together watching the sunrise. They turned when they heard him approach. He said the Consul had told him about the option. He asked what they wanted. Lyra said she'd spent her life studying how different species biology worked, always keeping emotional distance. Then this clumsy human pilot crashed into their ship and somehow crashed into her heart, too. It made no logical sense, but she didn't care. Senna said she'd spent her life afraid, protected by her grandfather, never leaving the estate. Daniel made her want to be brave, to explore, to live fully. With him and her sister, she finally felt ready to face the universe. Daniel told them he'd spent years flying alone through space, never staying anywhere long enough to build real connections. He'd thought that was freedom. But he'd learned that real freedom was choosing where you belonged and who you belonged with. And he belonged with them. They stood before the Interstellar Tribunal 3 months later. The same judges who'd sentenced Daniel now listened as he and Lyra and Senna requested legal recognition of their voluntary union. The lead judge, that stern Vrixian woman, allowed herself a small smile. She said the court's original verdict had required Daniel to marry the Consul's granddaughters for 1 year to make restitution. That verdict was now fulfilled and she was honored to grant recognition to a marriage that would last a lifetime. Outside the courthouse, supporters lined both sides of the street. Protesters were still there too, but they were outnumbered now. Braff. Daniel, Lyra, and Senna walked together through the crowd, heading toward their future. They'd started as strangers bound by legal decree. They'd become friends through shared struggle, and they'd chosen to become family through love. The universe was vast and complicated and full of different worlds. But they'd learned that the biggest distances weren't measured in light years. They were measured in understanding, trust, and the willingness to bridge the gaps between hearts. And sometimes the universe's harshest verdicts became its greatest gifts, if you were brave enough to let them.